Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Florian Roth from Fraunhofer Institute and myself, Miltos Ladikas from at.TechnologyITAS, are going to give you a presentation today about technology assessment and resilience, the concept of resilience in technology assessment. I'm going to give you a very short, rough introduction on technology assessment. Florian will talk after me about the concept of resilience within technology assessment. So I will start with a few words about ITAS, my institute. Florian will have the chance to talk about Fraunhofer Institute at another presentation. ITAS is the Institute of Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany. It was founded in 1995, and it's the largest and oldest scientific institution nationally in Germany, which deals with technology assessments, with about 120 scientific staff. One might say, actually, that's also one of the biggest in the world, considering that technology assessment is not so well known outside of Europe. But we have 120 scientific staff. We're a mix. We're an interdisciplinary group with scientists, engineers, but also social scientists and humanities experts. We run concurrently at any time about 50 projects. And we belong to the Helmholtz Association of Research Centers, HGF. And we belong to the program of Helmholtz called Technology, Innovation and Society. It's a unique program in the Helmholtz Association, which is also the biggest natural science funder in Germany. We are working for Helmholtz, as I said, but also we have a third-party funded project, and particularly because that's part of what TA is about. We work with German and the European parliaments and the European Commission. We actually run the Parliamentary Office of Technology Assessment at the German Bundestag, the German Parliament, for the past 25 years, and we also work with the European Parliament, advising the parliaments on science and technology issues. We work very closely with federal but also state ministries of science, like the Federal Ministry for Research and Education. A lot of our projects actually are directly towards the ministry, and we also do some university teaching. If one wants to see where we as a technology assessment belong in the overall German research and innovation system, you can see it here schematically. It's a federal system, so we have the federal government and 60 state governments that also have their own departments or ministries of science and technology, which they fund the public research institutions, amongst them the research organizations that you see there, which is the Fraunhofer, where Florian belongs, the Helmholtz Association, where I belong, and also the Max Planck, that is also well known in the Leibniz Association. These are funding the consultation exercises that work for both the research institutions and the government, federal or state government. And amongst others, there are some very well-known consultation exercises like the High-Tech Forum and the Innovation Dialogue of the Ministry. And TA, or our work, belongs also to that group. And nowadays, it also directly relates to the European Commission, because a lot of the work that we do is direct towards European level, European decision-making at the European Commission. So what is TA? TA has changed considerably since it has been established in the USA, actually, in the 70s. And the first official common definition that we have comes actually from the States in the 80s, and sees TA as a class of policy studies which systematically examine the effects on society that may occur when a technology is introduced, extended, or modified. So TA is seen here as a purely a policy advisory, a policy study exercise, and mainly the work of TA is risk assessment. Now in Europe and through the ages, TA has developed a lot. It has changed considerably. And in the 21st century, we have reached that common definition of TA, which sees it as a scientific, interactive, and communicative process which aims to contribute to the formation of public and political opinion on societal aspects of science and technology. So as you can see here, it's not only a purely scientific, purely policy, but it's also a communicative process that also works both at the policy and the public debate level. So TA functions mainly as a policy advice. This is our main work still, directed towards the ministry and the parliament. But also we function within the public debates, science and technology public debates, either the instigators, moderators, or through the participatory TA exercises that we do. We also work in the engineering process. We work with engineers together in product development. And a lot of it nowadays has to do with artificial intelligence. And this is basically the main TA functions. We have a variety of methodological models. A very rough description would be what we call the classical TA, which is the expert-oriented TA that focuses on risks, attempts to rationalize the debate, to diffuse the threat perceived by society, if you like. And it's mainly a one-way relationship between the technology assessment experts and the public, more like information, let's say, a process there. We also have participatory TA, which is a non-expert TA. The public is included in the TA process. There is a lot of focus on the value systems. And there we try to create what we call a coherent debate, a debate that is useful for policy making, because it takes also into consideration social values in it. We have a lot of experimental models there. And actually, in reality, there's a lot of overlap between the different methodologies. So this is only a very rough, but true at the same time, categorization on the methodological models. This table is more or less gives us an idea in some detail, but of course I will not go into great detail here. There is no time for that. It gives us the roles of TA, either as in terms of the issue, whether is the way is more on the technological aspect of the development, or the societal aspect, or even the policy aspect, through the impact dimension, which is either to raise knowledge, to form attitudes, or even to initialize straightforward actions. So TA works in a kind of diagonal from the scientific assessment to the decision taken, more or less. That would be the standard TA. One might say that a lot of the TA that happens nowadays is about forming attitudes and opinions. It's about agenda setting, mediation, and even restructuring the policy debate. We have also European Parliamentary Technology Assessment, a very specific group of TA that works at the parliaments. And even there we have a lot of differentiation if one sees it as a kind of triangular relation between politics, public, and science. As you can see here, the different models followed by different countries have a different weighing according to the parameters used in TA. In general, the European TA is an amalgamation of countries, of cultures, of norms, is a microcosm of what happens globally. It's not a one TA model per se, as there is no one European country per se. And that nowadays is moving towards the global aspects of TA. And we do that because, of course, we have science and technology issues that they have simultaneous effects across borders. We have nowadays real-world challenges that require common orientation, like the COVID challenge that we are asked to work a lot, significantly and urgently, actually, on. And for that, we need to move from the national to what we have done already, to the European, to a kind of global TA, where we have to take into account even more cultures, more value systems, more science and technology decision-making, but also different developmental stages, trajectories, or even the sustainable development goals. So we need to reflect, and that's what we do, on the possibilities and limitation of going global. We need to create transnational network approaches to our work, and also develop global concepts that can work along with common methodologies and structures. So quite quickly, we work on the conceptual and methodological aspect by creating a global TA frame. by standardizing the formats of the work that we're doing and also developing common concepts. One of them could very well be the concept of resilience that we are discussing today in our virtual symposium. In terms of structures, we are also activating at the global level, particularly within the UN system. And so what we plan to do is to have global projects on specific technologies. We're particularly interested in artificial intelligence or even genomics nowadays that is related to COVID debates. And we plan also to enhance our knowledge of how TA is done or TA-like activities are done at different nations across the world. So we have a group who are developing this group, the global group. We're very happy to discuss with you about that in some detail. That's only a rough introduction to the whole discussion. And now we'll pass the floor to Florian, and I will change my presentation so that Florian can talk to you a little bit in more detail about resilience. So here we are, Florian. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Miltos. Thank you all for joining this session. My name is Florian Roth. I represent Fraunhofer Society. It's like the largest society organization for applied research in Germany and one of the largest in Europe, with over 80 institutes and 25,000 researchers. And I'm based at the Fraunhofer Institute for System and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe. So just a stone throw away from Miltos KIT, and we closely collaborate on many topics. I joined the institute last year. Before that, I was working for about 9 years at the Fraunhofer Institute of Technology in Zurich, in Switzerland, in the Risk and Resilience group there. And I was invited here to provide a little introduction to my understanding of resilience and where it might fit into the the TA discussion and how resilience could connect to that. And obviously, like, resilience is currently like a big buzzword, and yes, I think there are very different competing understandings and also misunderstandings in the room, and I think it makes sense to clarify a little bit. Thanks. Right, so you can say over the last 5 to 10 years, resilience has really become popular in many different disciplines, and I think that's really a fortunate development, because I think it's a very powerful, very fruitful concept, and it has a lot of it's a very useful tool if you use it properly, and it's I think also a great chance for building bridges between different academic disciplines, between the private sector and the public sector. I mean, I've been just approached by large companies who want to understand their own resilience and how they can foster their resilience. On the other side, next please. Yes, that's just the trend of publications referring to resilience, and it's small, but it's really a sharp increase over the last 5 years, you can say. Next, please. A little surprisingly, if so many people are using this concept, this creates a lot of misunderstandings, or people talk past each other. So it's important to keep certain things apart and to understand what you actually mean by the concept, and there's obviously not one true answer to these kind of conceptual questions and definitions, because depending on the task, what you try to understand the phenomenon or the systems, and we at Fraunhofer ISI, we take a very systemic approach. We are strong on systemic analysis, and the understanding of resilience you need for these kind of analysis is very different compared to, let's say, if you just look at specific structures, materials, or and or systems that are just not that complex. So just if you wonder what these abbreviations are, it's like these are some topics I've been working on over the last decade, like climate change adaptation, critical infrastructure protection, and defense. And these are like three linked spheres where resilience has become one of the central concepts over the last couple of years. But just like to connect these different discussions, it's in reality it's very hard. Next, please. So I will just like put out a definition that's certainly not perfect, but I think it's a good working definition of systemic resilience. And I understand there's the ability of a system to absorb shocks, maintain or regain central functions, and it builds on the principles of robustness, redundancy, resourcefulness, adaptability, and self-organization. You could add further elements to it. For example, the ability of a system to really learn from past experiences, to adapt. And I think that's an important element if you have a broad understanding of resilience, and also the ability to experiment and to develop new solutions. And but what for the moment I think that's sufficient to define it in this very broad sense. So it's most important from my perspective is that it's about like absorbing shocks and really like regaining central functions, not exactly in the same fashion as the system has been prior to a shock event, but like that you actually reshuffle, reorganize, and then in a decentralized way, like recreate new functions, and in the end, ultimately, you survive. That's the ultimate goal: surviving and developing, prospering, and I think that's the essential point about resilience. Next, please. Just this is pretty small. It's just a screenshot from a study on social vulnerability. Just to stress the final point, I'm already coming to the end, trying to be really brief here, that for me, the way I look at resilience is not only about technical systems and it's not only about social systems, but it's really about the interaction of these two spheres in socio-technical systems. And the example that's a mapping of social vulnerability in the face of natural hazards and also pandemics. I think it's obviously very current study that we've done in partnership with Swiss authorities, trying to understand the resilience of a urban system in the face of very different challenges and stressors, and how the capabilities, the resources can help to absorb these shocks and adapt. And it's important that, for example, we looked at power shortages, blackouts, river floodings, and how the technical systems there function and what the resilience of these technical systems is. But we also try to really bring in the social aspect because the social behavior in the systems is very decisive. And I think like that's very challenging for us to analyze, but I think it's essential if you really want to understand the complexity of the whole system. So I'm going to stop there. I will have another presentation during in the context of another session, but for the moment I'll leave it here. Thanks very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Florian Roth. I work for Fraunhofer Institute. I'm happy to share some thoughts on resilience and the research I'm doing on measuring, understanding, and finally building resilience. As mentioned before, there are a lot of misunderstandings out there what resilience is and how it can be addressed and be modeled. So very briefly, what I'm going to talk about next about 10 minutes, I'm going to introduce the institute I work for, the Fraunhofer Institute for System and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe, and then talk about like two different pathways or schools of thought when talking about resilience. The third is coming from an engineering background, the idea of a bounce back. And the second is what I would call transformative resilience, where it's going beyond the bounce back, rather the bouncing forward. And I think it's very important to keep those two different conceptions of resilience in mind when talking about like how to measure resilience, how to operationalize it, and finding indicators, and how to also build resilience proactively, whether it's as a government or as an NGO. I think that's important to avoid these kind of misunderstandings. And finally, I'm going to talk about like the implications based on different conceptions of resilience for my research practice and for the advice we can give. So a little bit background about the Fraunhofer Institute I work for. I started there last year. It's the Fraunhofer is part of the Fraunhofer Society, which is consists of 72 institutes spread across Germany, a lot of technical institutes and expertise, 28,000 employees, and the largest organization for applied research in Europe. And what's rather special about the Institute for System and Innovation Research, you can see now on the right, it's not only technical expertise, but also economic and social science background brought together in interdisciplinary research. And we're doing like scientifically based analysis, but also like a lot of evaluations for large funding schemes. And we are very active in the field of forecasting, anticipating developments, whether it's ecological developments or political, social dynamics. And we take typically a systemic perspective on these developments to understand adaptation processes and transformation processes. Coming to the first school of thought relating to resilience, I looked up some book titles that you can find in bookstores talking about resilience, and then they can already see the basic idea behind many of those books. It's essentially about like a individual or a structure or a system that is like somehow pushed out of balance, that has experienced some kind of stress. And the resilience is about like regaining the functionality, bouncing back to the state as it was before the shock event. And you can see the function curve on the lower part, where it's essentially like resilience is like essentially trying to minimize the loss of functionality, recovering as fast as possible. So following this perspective, we can define resilience as the ability of a structure or system to withstand or absorb shocks, recover from these disturbances, and regain functionality. It's pretty straightforward and very helpful. For example, if we want to understand how an IT system or other critical infrastructure system, let's say like an energy grid, how after a disturbance, how we can build it in a way that it recovers quickly and to the largest extent possible. And if we look at resilience from this perspective, key attributes are robustness of the system, what the redundancies are, how rapid the processes are, and what's the level of interconnectedness. And then what research shows there, it's like we don't typically want hyper-connected systems because they are vulnerable, for example, to cascading effects. But also, like if the level of interconnectedness is too low, then also like the flexibility and the redundancies are suffering. So typically resilient systems aim for a kind of modularity. And really different to that is the perspective on the transformative resilience, what sometimes is referred to as the bounce back ability. And this approach has been developed mainly in the field of ecology, but then has been transferred to other fields such as psychology, organizational studies, disaster risk management, field in which I've been working over the last 10 years. And here the idea is fundamentally different. It starts with same, like you can see in the graph on the lower end, with a disturbance, but then the function, it's not only about like regaining functionality, but actually about adapting and learning from the disturbance and getting the system fit for future challenges. So we can define, following this understanding, resilience as the ability to withstand and absorb shocks. That's what also we find in the bounce back tradition. But going beyond that, also to learn from the disturbances, adapt, and if necessary, transform in order to survive. And I think that's much more like challenging to conceptualize systems in that way, but it's also very fruitful. And if you look at socio-technical systems and how they are adapting to new challenges, I think it's very promising approach. And if you follow this tradition, then you have additional attributes that you need to look at. In particular, like what is the resourcefulness? That means like what are the capabilities, the know-how that rest within different elements of the system, and how can they be accessed? For example, if there's some change in the environment of the system, let's say like in the case of an ecological system like a coral reef or mangrove forest, you have a storm or change in the water temperature, and this can even be like really weak signals. How is the system able to work with this weak informations and turn this information into an adaptation process? And this relates to the second attribute, which is diversity. And research shows that those ecosystems, but also like organizations, are more sustainable and resilient on the long term that I have a high level of diversity. And often these like rather independent, connected but independent system elements are showing phenomena such as self-organization and emergence, and they develop routines to adapt to disturbances in a more like a explorative, experimenting fashion. So what does this all mean for measuring resilience? I think it's really important to, if you want to assess and measure the level of resilience of let's say of an organization or a system or a whole nation, that it's a key question you have to ask yourself in the beginning, like, am I only interested in a bounce back, or do I also want to look at the abilities of the system to adapt and transform? Because this really has important implications for the measures we apply do we just want to measure performance and losses, or do we also look at the processes that help to support adaptive and transformative processes? And on the right, you can see an example, a study that we did in collaboration with the Swiss government in my old job when I was still working for ETH Zurich. And Switzerland is very active in the so-called Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, a global framework for managing natural hazards, but also very active now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this framework, there's a strong reporting element, and typically, like the resilience of nations that is being measured through this reporting mechanism is measured through economic losses to people affected by natural hazards. But an alternative way, if you look at resilience from more like a bouncing forward perspective, you also need like different indicators. For example, like what institutional learning capacities are there? Is there a strategy for dealing and engaging with stakeholders in coping with disasters? Is there like a mechanism for self-organization and so on? And these are very different indicators that you only need once you understand resilience as this ability not only to recover but also to learn and adapt. And last but not least, it's very important to decide at which level we are looking at resilience, because resilience is this like very multi-scalar phenomenon, and depending on the level you're looking at, it might be that you have to even break something or to maintain the resilience at a larger level. So it's always important to decide, are we interested in resilience at the organizational level, or of a whole, like a sector, or at the national level, or at the international level. And this then more or less like predetermines the measures you need. Finally, very briefly about the measures that we can employ to build resilience. I think that's very important to keep in mind that the resilience of technical systems can be imposed to a certain degree. If you think of like buildings, you can have building codes and make it mandatory to have certain reinforcements. So let's say like the building is like earthquake proof, but the same doesn't apply to socio-technical systems, which we typically work on. There, you have to develop collaborative resilience building approaches that involve a broad range of stakeholders and that try to reduce certain vulnerabilities within the system. And on the right side, you see like an example from a study I did with colleagues at the ETH Zurich that looks at vulnerable groups in the city of Zurich, like in the face of very different risk scenarios, from floodings to power blackouts to pandemics, and what are actually like the weaknesses and vulnerabilities within the system. And to address those vulnerabilities, you can't really make that top down. That really goes against the logic of building resilience. It's really about like empowering and building capacities to strengthen resilience, and this requires new modes of governance, which is often challenging, also in my experience working with policymakers. But I think it's essentially the only way we can actually start building resilience if we also talk about like what are actually the modes of governance. How can we come to like more network forms of governance, for example? So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking very much forward to the discussion online over the next days. Please feel free to contact me anytime. All the best.
Well, thank you very much for tuning in to my presentation, which is titled, Are You Ready for Disruption? Because in my presentation, I would like to go into the resilience considerations for cybernetic systems. And what all experts basically agree on is that we have to prepare ourselves for the disruption of digital systems that we are using. And as a society, we really have to prepare for that. I can give you many technical examples of why this disruption is imminent. I will only give you one just to start with. This is a news report from a few weeks ago about a typical exploit. It's called Zero Logon. It enables anybody that's on a Windows network to take over the complete network. And basically, we see this all the time with all kinds of digital systems, whether it's a Windows system or not. There are vulnerabilities in these systems, and they just keep coming up. And it's something that we really, it's a systemic risk that we have to take into account when we make our societies dependent on these systems. And we see that in politics as well. This is a screenshot from a discussion in the Dutch parliament that we, as an institute that I work for, try to advise on these subjects. And they really wonder, like, what can we do as a nation, as a government, about these issues? How can we make sure that systems are less vulnerable? And how can we become, as a society, more resilient to these vulnerabilities in case a disruption happens? And this all, I think, I think we can say there's a sort of a political awakening happening around these subjects. This is a picture from the United States. After the 2016 elections, politicians started to wake up and understand that digital systems are actually also a threat to the democratic system as we know it. That is because many companies are gathering data on people, and through this data they can create profiles, and based on these profiles, people can be influenced. So even elections outcomes can be influenced. So these are basically these digital systems are becoming a threat for all kinds of essential processes in our society. And for the Dutch Senate, we wrote a report on this. It's called Urgent Upgrade. In this report, we look at many, let's say, fundamental values in our society which are being are under threat because of digital systems. So we look at, of course, privacy, but also security, freedom, but also human dignity. All these fundamental values that are under pressure. And for this presentation, I thought, well, maybe I can look back at what our institute has done many years ago. Because when we talk about data gathering, this is not something new. There has been a tradition of gathering data on citizens for a very long time. And already back in 2007, our institute wrote quite, I think, a good report on this. It was called the Screening Society. And it was it took into account many new, at that time, methods for surveillance, so camera surveillance, license plate screening on the highways, DNA testing, phone tapping, all these type of technologies. And we looked at what was the overall impact on our daily lives. And at that time already, there was a trend of gathering data and creating risk profiles. And what was happening basically is that digital systems and the people, organizations in control of these systems are becoming more powerful, and citizens are actually becoming less powerful. Our conclusions were really that often the these systems are implemented with too high expectations of what it actually will gain. The effectiveness of these systems are usually hard to assess, so it's not really sure whether it was worth all the effort. It often leads to an information overload. There's too much information on people, and it's actually very difficult to gather something useful out of that. But our main concern with all these systems is that it impacts the position of citizens, and that it becomes much more difficult to know what systems know about you, and therefore there's a growing imbalance in power. Now, more recently, we looked at the digital threats of today in a report called The Never-Ending Race. And I think this is a very nice title because it kind of describes what is happening right now. There's basically a race between people who try to defend digital systems and those that are trying to attack it. And in this report, we create a nice overview of what type of actors are doing this and are working on both sides of this race. We see the main threats are government actors or state-related actors, so highly professional digital hacking groups from, for example, the United States, Russia, and China. And these undermine national security and economic competitiveness. And at the same time, we also see a more professional cybercrime scene. So nowadays, you can actually order or buy cyber criminal activities without actually being without it being necessary that you can do that yourself. And we see that the resilience to these threats is overall insufficient. Many organizations in government or private organizations, they lack basic security measures, whether that's just simple things like strong passwords or backups, but often that stems from insufficient understanding of these risks. There's still a low sense of urgency, and people look at cheap solutions instead of systemic solutions. And our conclusions, therefore, were to counter these trends was to create in the Netherlands independent expertise centers for small and medium enterprises to really support them in increasing their cyber resilience. And this has also happened after our study, after our advice. We also advise to implement hacking tests. So test critical sectors in our society, so the energy grids, the banking systems, all these type of sectors for their security. This has also been implemented after the report in the Netherlands. Of course, we stress that the government itself should set the right example for implementing security measurements. And there's also still a law in development on the duties of care. So we think that manufacturers and suppliers should be more accountable on the products that they provide. And of course, all of this is not possible without investing in training and expertise, because that's also something that is in many countries lagging behind the demand for expertise. And talking about expertise, there's another trend, and this report is only in Dutch, unfortunately, but I can translate it quickly for you. We see that there's an arms race on knowledge institutes. So there's a lack of experts in the world, and many countries are competing with each other to gain an advantage. And we see that on a geopolitical scale, again, the US, China, but also the EU are turning knowledge institutes into elements of their defense strategy. And therefore, civil and military research boundaries are fading. It's very hard to see whether a specific type of research is, in fact, military research or civil research, especially when it's about digital technologies that can be used in both ways. And we see that The assessment frameworks for example, dealing with dual use issues are no longer sufficient. So there has to be a new way to identify which topics are military significant, and we have to address the responsibilities that are associated with these identifications. On another scale, next to this knowledge conflict, there's of course just a geopolitical tension, and also we asked ourselves whether it's possible to think about a way to get out of these conflicts. So this is a report that we wrote on the cyber conflict, and a roadmap on how to end the conflict as we know it right now, or how to get into a de-escalation. And what we think is mainly lacking at the moment is a public opinion on cyber arms. There are no real international norms on what is allowed and what's not. And so this is really a first step that needs to be taken, that there needs to be a public dialogue and a norm about what type of cyber arms we think are okay, and how to then implement that into international norms. And finally, I'd like to touch upon a report which is called Cyber Resilience with New Technologies, in which we looked ahead at what type of technologies can be used to make our society more resilient to these threats. So this is more a technological approach. Of course, we know that cyber resilience is not just a matter of technology. Actually, it has to come from many different aspects. It's a mix of policy, culture, education, and technology, of course. In this report, we looked at all kinds of technologies, everything from 5G to quantum computing and machine learning. And what we see, basically, it doesn't really matter which technology you address, but all of them are making our society more vulnerable. They bring new possibilities, but all of them have their own vulnerabilities. They all increase the dependencies of our country or organizations on external parties. So there is a strong need for increasing the digital autonomy and improving the innovation climate so that there is less dependency. And there are really strong opportunities in the field of post-quantum cryptography and machine learning. So these are areas that need to be investigated more and invested more into. And this is just a quick preview of what we are working on. It's a report that will be published in a few weeks from now. It's called The Digital Threats to Democracy. And in this report, we really look at how new technologies are increasing the risk of disinformation. And we look specifically at deepfakes, which are technologies in which you can modify videos and fool people and make them believe that believe into something that doesn't exist. Well, we think that platform companies that are creating these technologies are mainly responsible for limiting the risk, but the governments need to act to make them do it. So there needs to be regulation. Because all the technological solutions we see for these problems, like detection systems, they are all insufficient. So there needs to be more of a regulatory approach to this. So coming to the conclusion of my talk on cyber resilience, what we see all throughout is that digital systems are highly vulnerable. And that we expect disruptions to occur. We also see that the bad actors are persistent, but also opportunistic. They really go where there is an opportunity. And often systems are vulnerable because the security costs have been underestimated. There's a lack of budget. And the issues are only addressed after the disaster already strikes. And all in all, we see that bad actors have a big advantage over the defenders. The technologies are in their advantage. And yeah, in order to overcome these challenges, we have to make sure that the power shifts away from citizens and users are reduced, so that that the dependencies become smaller. Well, I hope this gives you some food for thought. If you want to contact me, here are my contact details. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Lily Lim Camacho. I'm with CSIRO, so that's the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, which is Australia's national science agency. I am a value chain scientist and a research group leader for climate smart agriculture and value chain analytics. My background has always been in supply chains and new industry development, and in my foray into CSIRO have moved into climate change and climate adaptation. More recently, I've been quite focused on supply chain resilience, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I'll be talking to you about our approach to measuring resilience in Australian food supply chains and really questioning whether or not, are these adequate approaches and whether they're enough for us to actually understand the impact that we could have on the long-term sustainability of our food system. So, before I start, I might just talk to you a little bit about CSIRO. So we are Australia's national science agency, made up out of several business units. I come from the Agriculture and Food Business Unit, which is the first one that you see here, but we also are comprised of a wide range of science areas and impact areas. There's energy, health and biosecurity, land and water, manufacturing, mineral resources, oceans and atmosphere, and of course we've got some critical infrastructure as well that we manage of national significance. That's the some astronomy and space sort of infrastructure. Our newly named Animal Health Laboratory, which actually is working on a lot of COVID work, Data 61 as well. National facilities in marine, computing, and of course biodiversity collections. I'll start off about talking about the food supply chain, and of course this is the premise that some of you may not have encountered this work as well, work just yet under impact assessment. When I talk about the food supply chain, it's really the pathway by which you get your food. And obviously most of us will purchase food from supermarkets, and that's delivered through a massive distribution system that comes from various range of manufacturers and consolidators in the case of fresh produce, which is mostly sourced really from farmers locally as well as all around the world. Then, of course, let's not forget the input supply that actually comes into there, the fertilizers, seeds, water, energy that goes into farming that actually gets your food delivered to your table. But it's not a straight line, this food supply chain. It's not just a matter of the movement of product through it. There is also, obviously, the flow of information in this supply chain and the relationships that actually make them work. These are critical functions in the chain, but like I said, they're not just straight lines. They're often made out of networks, and they're quite complex. So let's look at how supply chains work, and to show you this dynamic, I suppose. We know that the product flows from one end to the other, and alongside that there are types of relationships that exist that actually facilitate information flow. So for example, in this case we've got input supplier and farmer relationships, and they might have a transactional relationship in that they'll come together at certain points of the year where a farmer needs supply, and the exchange of information is around that perspective. That might be quite different, that type of relationship, in that they might be closer or they might be a bit more distance. That depends on how relationships are managed between the two. Then you'll find that across the chain. Obviously the farmer might supply to a manufacturer, for example, if they're a big manufacturer, or they might supply to a consolidator who might then supply to a manufacturer. So the relationship then is a little bit more distanced, or it could be quite close as well. Again, the information that flows between the two depends on that type of relationship. Then you might have a bit more closer instances where, for example, a manufacturer might work quite closely with a supermarket because they have a strategic priority that they're actually trying to engage in. And with that, they might have closer relationships with their distributors and logistics providers that allows information to more freely flow. Now, we might call this a collaborative relationship or even a cooperative relationship, but that just means that it requires a different type of management to actually make that work. It requires closeness, it requires trust, and more freely flowing and more transparent information. And of course, once you look across the chain, the types of relationships and the nature of the information, the extent that they actually flow through varies quite significantly depending on who is in there and what are the priorities for these relationships. And that actually influences the contribution to value along the chain. So when we say value, it's not just value adding to a product, for example, processing it or packaging it, but actually how it's delivered, in what manner, and how is it positioned in the eyes of the consumer and the different customers within the chain. That is the value contribution. Sometimes that value contribution is the ease of relationships. So how easy are you to work with versus, do you have such stringent contracts that I can never reach? And that makes a difference to the way chains work. And as a result, because the value contribution varies along the chain, we might see as well a difference in the share of consumer profit, which is essentially the value returned to the chain. So that's the complexity of the chain, and you can see that it's quite dynamic. It varies significantly, and of course this is not just in the food chain. You can see this across the board in many other sectoral chains, but it's a really important aspect to think of when we start thinking of resilience and how do we understand the impact of potential interventions we could make in terms of resilience. If I dig deeper into how value chains work and what's inside them, we've talked about this middle part, the functions, information management, logistics and operations, and relationship management. Essentially, that's what I've shown you in the previous slide. We've also talked a little bit about the value creation perspective, which is the objective of the chain. But in the front of that, in terms of performance and priorities, as well as the back of that, which are the drivers behind how things are managed, these are the things that you need to unpack to better understand the complexity of chains. And they sit in the realm of what business priorities are. So we know that when we try to understand chains, it's very important to understand what is the culture of the businesses that operate the chain, that manage them, what are the strategies in place, and what are the processes that they have in place to actually carry them out, those strategies out. And at the same time, if you look at the other side of the chain on the right-hand side, you've got your performance indicators. In the past, we've been strongly focused on competitiveness of the chain. That sits in the realm of the economics and profitability. But now we are far more aware that there are other priorities that chains need to actually respond to and deliver to. And that includes environmental impact, equity, and inclusion in terms of how they treat consumers as well as how they treat each other. And of course, resilience. And this is what we're all about today. We know that because of the complexity of value chains, there are systems, complex systems. They've got different actors, different drivers, different functions, and all different priorities. And that's when we start to understand, is this one system or is it a nested system then that we need to better understand? And that's why it gets hard to measuring. It gets hard to measure resilience in chains. You can read more about this type of work in reports that I have, and you've got the references there down at the bottom. So let's think about supply chain resilience now. I picked up this colleague of mine actually picked up this reference from Tyndall in Global Food Security, and it's good to actually think of supply chain resilience in the context of the broader food system. And Tyndall actually looks at resilience of food systems as a way of actually as a function of how the food system delivers food to all. so that you can provide it sufficiently, appropriately, and in a manner that can be accessed. So that's the function of the food system, and resilience is the capacity for it to continue functioning in light of the different disturbances or disruptions that it might actually encounter. So how does that translate then to the supply chain? If you think of what are the different priorities of supply chains, one of them is, to be competitive. One of them is to actually have a low impact, to be resilient, and to provide equitable access for all. The definition of the food system does not capture certain aspects of the priorities of the supply chain, but at the same time, the supply chain is actually quite a narrow system or a smaller system to actually focus on in light of the broader food system. So when I say food system, it's really all the food that we consume and the different systems that actually deliver to that, including biodiversity and the landscape, our soils, water, food, and energy. So if I think of how does this translate to supply chains, you start to look into what is the capacity of the chain to absorb shocks. You also look at their ability to recover. So the capacity is, in the Australian context, actually it's that toughness of the farmer that we always tend to think of. I think it's widely seen across the board, across the world, that farmers are known to be quite tough and can withstand pressure just because of the nature of farming. It's also the same in supply chains. So it's translated over that this capacity to absorb shocks is a function of resilience. The other is the ability to recover, so the ability to stand up again, get up again, and rebuild. That's often the goal, to immediately rebuild and recover from shocks. And then, of course, the last thing is the ability to persist and deliver to objectives. There's a key assumption in these resilience perspectives of change, that the system stays the same or returns to what it used to be, which, if you look into adaptation literature in terms of climate, for example, returning to where we used to be or to the baseline, it may not be desirable. So there's an aspect here to actually start considering when it comes to assessing for the impact of interventions, for example, or the impact of technology in terms of supply chain resilience, is what are we truly aiming for? Do we want to recover and go back to what we used to be, or do you want to come out better? So now I'm going to talk to you about our approaches to measuring supply chain resilience. Now, you might ask, I'll go back a step, given what I've told you, that supply chains are complex, that, that resilience is simply is a function of the chain that it is displayed in multiple ways and can be measured in multiple ways, and also has different aspirations behind it. Why are we measuring resilience? Why are then we looking at quantitative approaches? Because some might feel that that's a very narrow approach. We try to do this because of that complexity. When we talk to managers of supply chains and businesses, when we start looking at resilience and climate adaptation, there were a lot of barriers being put in place in terms of it's quite uncertain what we're going to do. We don't know what's going on. It's too hard. I've got a lot of priorities that I'm dealing with at the moment, and I've got an annual time frame to deal with this. We know that when it comes to resilience and adaptation, we need to look further down the line, look at more longer term. There's a lot more uncertainty and there's a lot more complexity. So to take away some of those barriers, we wanted to start at a simple point and look at what are the measurements that managers can use to actually start this process. And that's why we came up with quantitative approaches to supply chain resilience. So the supply chain index was developed by Eva Plagani, a colleague of mine, and you've got the paper available here, which is it's open access. And essentially, we applied this to the fisheries industries. Several industries were analyzed, and we started to look at what are the different ways you can actually measure or approach resilience in these chains. There are 3 measures that we had come up with, and in here, very simply, I'll describe to you what are the different ways we tried to unpack resilience. So the first one is evenness, really. So that tells you, based on the volume of product and the number of connections in the chain, how evenly spread is the product moving along the chain. So you can see here in these 3 circles here, the focus of evenness is on the connections. So you've got 2 suppliers to a customer, but one supplier with that heavier line that you can see actually denotes that it has a bigger volume of product flowing through compared to the second supplier down the bottom, which is a thinner line. Evenness tries to look at things this way, so that if you are more skewed towards one supplier, if that supplier gets disrupted, then you have a bigger exposure as a customer. So that's the premise behind evenness. Of course, there's a quantitative approach to that, which you can find in the paper. The second one is connectivity, which is how well connected are you to others. So you can see in here, you've got your customer as well, right in the middle, and there are 2 forms of 2 examples of connectivity. One has multiple connections, and the other one is a straight line, what we call a simple chain or a simple network. The one that has more connections is what we might call a more complex network. And in this one, the premise is if you have more connections, you have more options to draw from, therefore you might be more resilient. Whereas if you're relying only on single connections, then you might be a bit more exposed. So that's another way of looking at resilience. So combine that with evenness and combine evenness and connectivity, then you get a better nuanced understanding of, how does this chain work and where is it highly dependent on. That leads us to criticality. So if, for example, you start to build on your understanding, you start to identify which part of the chain are you depending on the most. And it's a combination of measures. And in here you can see that it starts to look at how much product is flowing through the chain as well as how many connections as well. And that the red dot in the middle denotes that this is the critical node that you are actually dependent on. It's not just who is actually, it's not just single connections or volume of connections, but a combination of these sorts of things. So these 3 measures actually combine to form the supply chain index, which is a 1-number metric that gives you a measure of resilience. And that has been the starting point for a lot of conversations. I'll tell you now about how we've moved on from this perspective. Now, how have we applied it to other issues? So from there, from that body of work, we started to think of what then does it mean for climate adaptation. Like I said, it identifies critical nodes, it provides chain-wide metrics. We've applied that work to now, since then, to over 40 chains, both from an industry perspective, which means that you look at, in general, a structure of the chain and very broadly try to map out a generic perspectives of the chain. So you don't need to go into which company, for example. You might just say processor and all that. So it's a little bit distance. We've also applied it to business chains, which could be very, very specific and has a lot of networks. What we've understood is that because of the simplicity of this approach, it can be applied in multiple contexts, multiple sectors, and that's how we've applied it to about 40 chains, both in 3 sectors. So that's mostly in food and agriculture, but also fisheries and mining. What this has led to in terms of our impact is that companies have actually redesigned supply chains in light of supply security. So it's given them a starting point to understand, for example, in the case of the figure you can see here, which part of the chain is actually critical, and therefore what are the systems around that critical node or critical activity that actually allows us to keep this resilient, or do we need to do something to actually support it? Or is it too hard because of the nature of relationships that we have around this, that we cannot actually rely on this node? So these are the questions that they're starting to unpack. And you can find out more about this in the paper that we have, which is co-authored obviously with Eva Plagani as well, and that's available in Global Environmental Change. A second part of this, the same sort of body of work is looking at what if you started to disrupt these chains. Given the criticality of the nodes, given its supply chain resilience and its structure, what would happen if you started to disrupt the chain? So we started to look into scenario analysis and comparing different types of chains, so simple versus complex. As you can see here in this figure, we looked at fisheries chains, agriculture and mining, so 6 chains altogether, and tried to look at simple chains, those with fewer connections and smoother flows, and complex chains, ones where you can visually see how complex they are. And what happened here is that we actually disrupted chains annually, randomly across the different activities there. We also looked at that critical node, and here we call it key element, and we disrupted it once every 5 years. And also we had the scenario where we disrupted that key element every year for 5 years. And as you can see, in some instances, for example, in here in this key element annual, where you got really low numbers here, one of the chains actually went down to 0 in terms of their resilience. So in our translation, it disappears, it fails to exist. So it actually, crosses that mark of the ability to persist. So that's one thing that we found out here, that you can actually do that with chains and in this type of modeling approach. It's quite simple to do this approach, but it actually, what the good thing is, you no longer have to dwell so much in the analysis, but you move on to the conversations that matter. So it just is a great jump-off point for understanding what resilience and adaptation is. But yes, this has become a really good perspective of how we might think of the impact of climate change on value chains, and how might we actually support adaptation in value chains. So what then? Now that we're seeing this, we know that the measures give us an insight on structural resilience, which is really the first figure that I've shown you before, which is really just all about the flow of the product. But it doesn't actually yet take into account functions in the chain that really contribute to resilience, which is, it doesn't talk about information flow, it doesn't talk about the types of relationships, it doesn't talk about the value contribution, but that is actually quite possible. So in terms of value, in terms of dollar value, we can do that pretty immediately because it's transaction-based data that we're using. However, it doesn't give you an aspect of dynamics and power and trust in relationships, which also contribute to resilience. It also doesn't attempt to measure adaptive capacity. And really, adaptive capacity comes down a lot to the culture of businesses within the chain, the strategies and the processes that they have in place, and how they actually manage the functions in the chain. But one very important aspect of this body of work is that they spark really good conversations that are grounded in terms of what can managers really do. And this is one of the key aspects of this approach, is that the simplicity allows for different types of managers to actually access the information, as well as make decisions on that basis, or at least start to dig a little bit deeper as to what they could do in their realm of responsibility. And just to sum up, we know that measuring resilience in supply chains is only a step in truly understanding resilience. And now we have an approach, simple approaches that actually allow us to progress that. But we know that it's not enough. We know that these are, taken in a very wrong way, there can be quite theoretical approaches to supply chains and not actually reflect what is going on in the ground. So really the critical part to understanding the impact of this type of work or any intervention that we have that will hopefully lead to improved resilience is working together with the decision makers who are actually going to be implementing them. And that has been a cornerstone of the work that we do at CSIRO. We do need to take care that this is understood in the way that we have designed it to be, and we will keep on actually pursuing different ways of looking at resilience based on the different perspectives of within the chain. As we know, they're complex systems, and with complexity, that might be different priorities and different perspectives. And we continue to focus on those approaches to supply chain resilience. And that is it for me. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your questions and your feedback on this body of work. If you'd like to stay in touch, my email can be found here, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
My name is Mia Thompson, and I will today present a project by the Danish Board of Technology Foundation on the rising sea level and the future cities in Danish coastal areas. I am a project leader of the project, and it will focus on resilient and participatory technology assessment. So a little bit of background I'll get into before getting to the high of the presentation is that the climate is changing, as we all know, and it's especially a problem in Denmark due to a very long coastal line. We have over 7,000 kilometers of coastal line, and we are a very low-lying country. A lot of the Danish coastal cities are right at the edge of the land, of the coast, and out of our 98 municipalities, 76 of them are actually coastal municipalities. So a lot of our municipalities in Denmark are currently grappling with the issues of frequent flood, sea level rise, and how to make the coastal cities more resilient and adapt to this change in the climate. Previously, we had a lot of focus on cloudburst, and the municipalities have been able to strategize and handle these issues, and they've planned for it. So now the focus has shifted in the last years or so, 10 years or so, more to storm surges and how we might be able to adapt to these issues. Both climate and cities are, I'll just move myself a little bit up in the corner, are dynamic, which is vital in this discussion, because how do we want to live in the coastal cities, and how do we want to use them, and how do we want to make them more climate resilient? So that is the main background for this project, is how to make the Danish coastal cities more resilient to the changing climate. How do we want to live in them in the future? And how do we use them to the needs that we have now, but also the coming needs, so to speak. So the project is called Cities and the Rising Sea Level. It is led by the Danish Board of Technology Foundation, as I mentioned, and it runs from 2018 to 2020-21, depending on how the pandemic pans out, so to speak. It is one of the 4 parts of an extension project led by the Danish private foundation called at.The. They're funding it. And the focus on the project is to initiate a debate on the future of coastal cities in Denmark, and to create a knowledge base and to raise public discussions on how we want to live in the cities, as I mentioned before, with the visions for the cities and how to adapt to the climate change. So the main approach for this project is participatory technology assessment, and it's, so to speak, the backbone and the main focus on how we built this project up, how we mapped it out, how we planned it. It is to involve the stakeholders, citizens, politicians, local politicians from the beginning, and to make sure that we have all the voices heard in this dialogue. So it's all about the dialogue, it's all about debate, and it's executed as a very coherent process, as I will show you on the slide. So what you see here in the picture on this side is the process for the project. And it starts with input scenarios that we've created. And these scenarios have been tested on a scenario workshop. It's to create new inputs where we had different stakeholders, ones who work very in-depth with climate change and ones who work on the fringes of it and ones who work mostly with flooding. So it was a very wide debate on what would be the most interesting aspects to include in these scenarios. And then afterwards we had some workshops with the local politicians, so we could draw out what they see as the most challenging things in regards to adapting to the changing climate in these coastal cities. So we spoke about long-term planning. What are the issues with having this long-term planning? What makes it so that they're not already doing it? And how can they finance these needs for solutions? And then after that, we had a workshop with experts to discuss the current technical solutions that we could implement in these coastal cities to avoid flooding in the houses, and also to discuss what could some technical solutions be in the future. Are there solutions coming that we don't know already, or do we have to rethink the current solutions we have in other contexts? So could some of the old-fashioned techniques from the day of yonder, or some of the ones we have now, could they be implemented in a new way? And all of these different workshops, all of these different seminars that we've had sort of lead into our citizen summit, which is in Danish, borgertopmøder. On these, we have a discussions with the citizens about all of these things that we've learned throughout the process about the challenges and the possible solutions, the strategies of how to adapt to the changing climate. And then they will vote and discuss on these things. And I'll get more into the Citizen Summit later. And then after that, we will have a seminar with politicians, and we will have a hearing in the Danish Parliament. And then at the end, these output scenarios will have changed throughout the process based on all the input from the different stakeholders and so forth. So we now have a very different output from when we started. So these three scenarios, I'll get a bit more into those. They look at different time horizons of within the next 100 years. So we look at today, we look at year 250, and we look 40 years ahead. So the latest time horizon we have is 2090. So the three scenarios have three different approaches, three different strategies to how we handle this water. The first one is we keep the water out. The second is we invite the water in. And the last one is that we retreat. So I'll get a little bit more into it. We have here an illustration of what we keep the water out could look like. What we do in this strategy and what we described it as is that we protect the values that we have today, but we do not get ahead of ourselves with solutions. So we look much towards the solutions that we've already implemented today, dikes and so forth, and we protect in smaller areas. We do it project by project. So we don't do the long-term planning as much. We look more of what are the needs today and how do we protect them. The next one is the one where we invite the water in. We take the chance and we invite the water into our cities. We try to create solutions that have these added benefits. We try to be more creative, but we also know that by inviting the water in, there's a chance that we will not be able to handle it in the city, so to speak. But we try to get added benefits out of this water, and we try to incorporate it in the cities to get new solutions. And the last one is that we retreat. We realize that in Denmark, we have a lot of low-lying areas. More or less all of Denmark is very much low-lying areas. So we have a lot of areas that we won't be able to protect, or it will be too expensive to protect them. They might not have enough values as they are today to have a huge project implemented. So in these areas, we map them out and we say we will retreat for them. We will build in the city, in towards the land. Instead, we will turn the development of the city in, and we will have more temporary activities in these areas. So we remove some of the most valuable things, and we try to have more recreational areas instead. The issue here is, of course, that we also in Denmark have a lot of cultural heritage that we are not able to move in the same way. So these are the three scenarios that we had at the beginning of the project, and they've gone through all of these different workshops and seminars with all the different experts and local politicians and stakeholders and so forth. And then we present them to the citizens, and we discuss with them on a citizen summit that we had in September. We had the first of two about what they think of all these different strategies, approaches, and we had some themes that came up throughout this process. And these themes were discussed and voted on at the Citizen Summit. And they were strategies. What kind of strategy do we want to apply in Denmark going forth? And they voted on which one of the strategies they felt was the most sound strategy going forward. And a lot of them actually wanted to invite the water in or to retreat. They were less about the protect what we have, and they were more about looking forward and how do we move forward. The other one we had as a theme was roles and responsibility. Who should have the responsibility, the overall responsibility for climate change and climate adaptation implementation in Denmark? And they really wanted more on the national level, but still to have the local knowledge. But they wished to have more long-term plans that went above and beyond the administrative borders that we have today. They wanted plans that went more regional and more and less municipality by municipality as we do it today. And another theme were financing, how we will finance all of these needed solutions. This one was a bit more tricky because the system in Denmark today is that the one who benefits is the one who pays. So if you are to benefit from a dike, so to speak, you will have to pay for it as well. And they were willing to say that if you have a temporary house, if you have a summer house, you will have to pay for it. But if it's more of your long-term home, not your summer holiday, then the government will have to help fund that as well. And the last theme we had was what are the risk willingness of the Danes. And that's what you can see on these illustrations as well. It shows two different solutions that we discussed with them, that they could have the dike, they could have it now, but it would take the view of this beautiful area, or they could have a storm surge that would be further out in the land. They wouldn't see it as much, but that would take 10 years for them to build. So the question here was, and what we wanted to learn from this was, how risk adverse are the people in this summit? How risk adverse are the Danes? And they were actually willing to wait for the long-term solutions, the one that wouldn't decrease the value of the nature around them, or that wouldn't remove some of their view, and wait 10 years for solutions that would be further out and that wouldn't actually have as much impact on the day-to-day. And we were very surprised about this one, because we expected that the risk willingness would be very low, because that's what the debate we hear at the moment is, that people want the solutions now, and they want it not in 10 years, but they want it tomorrow. And all of these discussions that we've had throughout the process with all of these different stakeholders and so forth, and the citizens, will then lead into a parliament hearing. We will also have an event with the youth to see what the youth of today, as they are the ones that will be living in the next 2100 until 2100, what they think about all of this. So we will also present all of these scenarios, the future scenarios, to them and see where they stand with it. Then all of this will be taken to a parliament hearing. It will be presented so the politicians can see what the different people think about climate change adaptation in coastal cities and the rising sea level in Denmark. All of this and the output of all of this project will be a local toolbox. So we have the debate scenarios that are presented. We have created different dialogue methods with different stakeholders, with citizens, with local politicians, how to engage in dialogue with them, and also to create some local guidelines for these different areas, for the municipalities, on how to use different technologies in different ways for protecting the coastal line and the valuables. And then we will have policy recommendations with very concrete solutions aimed at both the national, the regional, and the local level. And that is what will be the output of the project at the end and of this process. And that is all I have to present.